Let's find a seat so we can get started.
You don't want to be the one that jumped down there.
Sorry, just the 48 hours. Me too. I don't have to check.
Find a seat if you would. Find a seat. Find a seat. Okay. I was in a conversation with my older brother, some random long conversation, and he said to me, I was reading a fabulous article the other day, a fabulous article. I said, well, what was it about? It was about the economy. I said, well, who is it by?
He said, "Here, I'll give it to you.
He said, it's by some guy by the name of Tim Taylor.
I can always give it to you."
And I don't often get one up on my older brother, but I said, I know Tim. And yes, he is a wonderful scholar and a wonderful gentleman. And he lives in our neighborhood, and he and his family come to peace. So it is a joy for me to not only say that, but to welcome Tim to this forum to tell us a little bit about the economy. So I'm not going to take any more of his time. Let's give him a welcome, please.
I don't know whether I need a microphone or not, so people think yes, okay, we'll go with it. I guess the first thing to say to all of you is, happy Sunday. I bet a lot of you didn't get up this morning thinking, gee, hope I get to hear an economist right after church. My wife likes to say that economists are people who wanted to be accountants but didn't have the personality to do it. My favorite story about economists is one that involves Frankenstein's monster. In this story, Frankenstein has built his monster from the ground up, and it's a beautiful monster. It's all ready to go. It has one problem: it doesn't yet have a brain. And because this is an economic story, there's of course a store for brains, and so there's supply and demand and all the rest. And so Frankenstein goes down to the village to the brain store, walks into the brain store, and says, "I've got my monster ready to go. What have you got in stock?" And the guy behind the counter says, well, I've got some very nice physicist brains at $30 a pound. And Frankenstein says, I don't know, I'm just not seeing the monster as a physicist. I'm just not. I don't know, what else have you got? He says, well, I've got some nice philosophy brains at $60 a pound. And Frankenstein said, I'm just not seeing the monster as a philosopher. I don't know. And he says, well, I've got some economist brains at $100 a pound. And Frankenstein says, that just seems crazy. What makes economist brains so expensive? And the guy behind the counter says, do you have any idea how many economists it takes to get a pound of brains? It's all supply and demand, people. It's all supply and demand. I find that when I come to talk to different groups, the basic question that's in the back of people's mind, perhaps especially a month or so after an election, is sort of like, in The Wizard of Oz when they say to Dorothy, are you a good witch or a bad witch? And so what they want to know, are you a good economist or a bad economist? And what they really mean by that at some level is, are you going to lecture me about politics? And I promise you in advance, I'm not going to lecture you about politics. My mental image here is of my grandmothers, both of whom I love very much. They've passed on some years now. But we used to refer to them in my family as the dueling grandmothers, because while they both loved us very much, they didn't necessarily love each other a whole lot. And so if you were talking to one grandmother, the other grandmother would come up beside you and begin talking to you simultaneously, completely disregarding the first conversation. Dueling grandmothers, right? And so one grandmother was from downstate Illinois, and that's a deeply Democratic area, and she voted Democrat all her life, and she believed that Republicans were basically knaves, scoundrels, and fools. Her proudest moment was probably when Richard Nixon was impeached. That was a great day for her. My other grandmother came from Cincinnati, an area where most people voted Republican, and she voted Republican all her life, and she believed that all Democrats were knaves, scoundrels, and fools. It's not clear to me that either grandmother actually disagreed with the other on very much, but they'd grown up the way they'd grown up, and they had really strong feelings about it, and it wasn't a good thing to talk about in the family. Did I say we had dueling grandmothers, right? I'm tired of dueling grandmothers. I was tired of dueling grandmothers a long time ago. So I'm not going to be a good witch or a bad witch. I'm just going to try and tell you what's actually happening in the economy, what's going on. Because to me, that's hard enough, and that's interesting enough. So let's take a run at a few things here. We've had a recession and we've had a pandemic. And the pandemic recession was really different than other recessions we've had. Let me try and give you a sense of how. And again, I know a lot of you probably didn't get up this morning thinking, oh great, I sure hope there's some economics graphs after church, but here we go, right? I promise there aren't too many. So this is a graph of domestic product. That's the size of the economy, right? And it's whether the GDP is going up or down. So it goes up and down, up and down, and up and down, that's zero. The shaded areas are where recessions occurred. And so that's where it gets negative, right? It goes below zero. And so in this, since 1970, that's 50 years ago, you can see the pattern of the economy. This is quarter by quarter, so every 3-month periods, right? And again, you can see it goes up and down, you can see the recessions pop out. That's the Great Recession of 2008. That's the dot-com recession, the little shallow one. That's the recession after the savings and loan crisis in 91. Those are the recessions of the OPEC years back in the 1970s. So it's all there, right? This is the pandemic recession. Now just look at that. I mean, compared to all these other pretty big events, I mean, that's a real drop, right? So one thing I want to convey to you is the pandemic recession was really deep. And when it was happening, there was reason to panic. Because it was deep. I mean, it was out of bounds of other things we'd seen. The other thing about the pandemic recession, I told you the lines tell you the width of recessions. Like, you can see they call this the Great Recession, or the Great, because it's long. You know, that's a wide period. This recession back in 2001 was only about 6 months, so it's not as wide. This recession, you can see, is barely there. I mean, in terms of width, it's like long, right? So there's this huge rebound happening right after. In fact, this recession is a total of 2 months long, according to people who put dates on these things. We've never had a 2-month recession before. On the other hand, we hadn't had a pandemic recession before. So one thing I want to try and get across is this was a short recession, but a really severe one. A really disruptive one. You can see the same sort of thing if you look at the unemployment rate. So this is the unemployment rate. Again, I went back to 1970, a half century ago. Again, the lines show the recessions. Again, you can see in recessions, the unemployment rate often goes up, sometimes keeps going up for a little while after the recession is officially over. And then you see the unemployment rate during the pandemic. And it's out of bounds, right? I mean, this was a bad recession in 2008. This was a bad recession back in the early 80s. And this is something that we just hadn't seen. So when this is happening in March and April of 2000, it's genuinely scary if you're an economist. I mean, you don't know that it's going to come back down, right? You don't know where things are headed. All you know is that you saw this enormous swing. So it turns out to be short, but you don't know that in March and April. And so it's terrifying, frankly. I mean, there's a couple times in my life I've been terrified looking at economic trends. One was September 2008, March and April of 2020 was another. I mean, it's genuinely scary stuff. So, the pandemic, of course, was more than just a recession. I had a kid who was at the time at the University of Michigan, so probably some of you had to do this too. You have to get in the car and drive 10 hours on, 2 days notice because they're shutting the campus and you don't know what's going on. You got to go pick up your child and bring them home. Everyone's at home. It's a scary time. And looking back now, it's more than 2 years later, we sort of know how it came out. But it's worth remembering that it was a genuinely disruptive time for us personally, and also for businesses. I mean, if you were running a restaurant or you were running a retail operation, probably some people here are connected to stuff like that, it was remarkably hard. In fact, in a way, you were toast. I mean, who said to you, oh, you could just shut your doors for 2 months. Pay your bills, pay your employees, you have no sales. Good luck with that. I mean, that's a very frightening time if you're in those businesses. If you're in, travel business, airline business, all those kinds of things. So a lot of people are under extreme stress. So from the economic point of view, not getting into the public health side of it, I just want to emphasize 3 things about the recession. One was that for all of us at work, it was a terribly disruptive time. Many of us discovered we could work from home, and that might be good, it might be bad, but boy, was it ever disruptive. Same with schools, same with a lot of other jobs. A second thing was that there was a really strange pattern that evolved. Most of the time when there's a recession, like these different recessions that happened before this, what tends to happen in a recession is people feel the pinch and they put off things that are a little bit optional. So like you don't buy a new house during a recession. You wait till things get better. You don't buy a new car. You don't buy a new refrigerator. Maybe you don't buy a new suit of clothes. I mean, you trim back on some things, right? And you trim back on those big purchase goods like cars and houses and clothes and so on. But the pandemic recession was different. In the pandemic recession, all this stuff is closed down. Restaurants and all the rest. And when they're all closed down, it's not the goods that go down, it's the services that people buy. It's the travel, it's the entertainment. And so just to give you a little sense of that, this is the typical pattern for expenditures on services and expenditures on goods. So you can see goods are the red line, and during the 2008 recession, this is what you expect to happen. Goods dip because people put off cars and houses and all those kinds of things. People don't buy as many goods. And if you went back through time, I could show you similar graphs for pretty much every recession. Goods fall in recessions is like an iron law of my life. Oh, welcome to my life, people. But then you get over here to the pandemic recession, and notice services barely ever, sometimes just barely go negative. They tend to tootle along. And then, of course, when nobody could get any services, services dip wildly and come back a lot, but goods also dip wildly, and goods go way back up above services. So that's a very strange pattern. You don't expect goods to fall, you don't expect goods to rise that much, and you notice goods again over here have fallen again. So there's something weird going on there. That we don't expect to see. This drop in services, this rise in services, really makes things change. And if you project out with more complicated things than I'm showing here, the amount of goods people are buying is still well above where it was before the recession started. The amount of services people are buying is still down. I mean, a lot of us aren't traveling the same way. We aren't buying tickets to things the same way. We aren't going out to dinner the same way. Those are all kinds of services. And so, that's important because when we start talking about inflation, we are living in a world where all of a sudden demand for goods went way up. People had money and they wanted to spend it on physical stuff. And that was something the economy wasn't necessarily ready for. Then the third thing I wanted to point out was just the sharp disruption of business practices and planning that happened through all this stuff. If you're running a business or you're in some management position, there are certain times when you're just trying to make it through the day, or just trying to make it through the week, or just trying to make it through the month. There are not times when you say, what's my long-term plan for making my business better? What's my long-term plan for expanding my market? What's my long-term plan for investing in the future? What's my long plan for research and development? You know, you're going through the pandemic, your long-term plan is Tuesday. Maybe I can make it to Tuesday. And so that's very disruptive to an economy. Economies like to have sort of forward-looking things evolving, and when everybody's scrambling, then that hurts. And I'll talk about some of the ways it hurts as we go along. So what does the government do in response to this stuff, these patterns I've been pointing to? Well, the government basically does 3 things in spring of 2020. One is that it hands out stimulus checks. roughly $800 billion worth of stimulus checks. Another is that it does something called the Paycheck Protection Plan. And that was assistance to businesses because of all these businesses that we were worried would literally just disappear if we didn't get them some cash. And those were given in the form of loans that were expected never to be repaid. And the general idea there was we just needed to get money out the door for the stimulus, for the businesses. Now we're looking back and sort of saying, wow, a lot of people got that money and I'm not sure they really needed it. But at the time, you saw those lines, right? I mean, this stuff, we don't know that that's coming back down again. We don't know what's going to happen. And so I find it really hard to blame people for what they did under the force of that moment in spring of the year 2020. And then the third thing was, see, I have to make lists here, I forget what I'm talking about as I go along, was the unemployment extensions. And in both the federal and state level, we extended unemployment payments to people, and that was probably another $630 billion or so. So we're talking really big numbers here. By comparison, the Stimulus Act that was passed in 2008 during the recession was about $800 billion. So we basically did 3 times that Stimulus Act of 2008, and we did it in a really short period of time. So if you look at government spending, total federal spending, it's about $4.7 trillion in 2020 or 2019. Then in 2020, with the pandemic stuff, it goes from 4.7 trillion to 6.7 trillion. So you can, work out the math yourself, but anything that increases $2 trillion in a year, that's a really big increase. And then it goes up a little bit more, 7.1 trillion by 2021. Now again, early on, I have a hard time saying that was a real problem because spring of 2020 was a scary time. But it didn't stop in spring of 2020, right? When the economy sort of bounced back and when unemployment came back down, those payments were still going out. And so that's when you begin to think, okay, was that really the right plan? Or are we reacting by sort of doing something, even if the something isn't necessarily what needs to happen? There's an old law in policymaking circles. It's a false syllogism. So you'll see if you can spot the logical error here. Step 1, we must do something. Step 2, here is something. Step 3, we must do it. I think a certain amount of policy making goes that way. Like we have to do something, here's something, we have to do it. And there's not necessarily a lot of thought over whether that particular something is the particular thing you wanted to do. The worst part of it, and the most difficult part of it, I guess, is, again, goes back to the nature of what a recession is. Most recessions are, again, about supply and demand, but going back at least to the work of Keynes in the 1930s, we tend to think about recessions as a time when the demand in an economy goes down. And I guess the way I try and say this, describing, say, the Great Depression, was that Keynes pointed out, during the Great Depression, it wasn't like factories got destroyed, right? It wasn't like technology got uninvented. It wasn't like workers lost their skills. The capacity of the ability to supply goods and services stayed about the same. I mean, there was no natural disaster. There was no war that happened during that time. What happened was the financial system collapsed, and there wasn't any demand for those goods. And so the lack of demand was what caused problems. You can make a similar point about the 2008 recession. In 2008, there wasn't a war, there wasn't a natural disaster, things didn't get uninvented, workers still had the same skills, the factories and things were still there, but we had a huge recession. Why was that? It was because the financial system collapsed and there wasn't demand for things. So if there's not demand for things, what do? If you're the government, you pump more demand out there. You have stimulus checks, you have the Paycheck Protection Plan, you help unemployment insurance. You put demand out there in the economy to sort of help the economy bounce back from the lack of demand. But here's the problem with a pandemic recession. It wasn't a lack of demand. It wasn't a collapse of the financial system, it was a pandemic. It wasn't a demand problem, it was a supply problem. the economy was unable to produce these things because people were worried, they were staying at home, they were locked down, they were not able to attend things, there were rules getting in the way, there were fears getting in the way, and legitimate fears. I'm not trying to make light of it. But the problem is that you can fix, to some extent, a demand recession by putting more demand out there. You can't fix a supply recession by putting more demand out there, because there just isn't supply. It just isn't there. The capacity of the economy to produce was shut down by the pandemic. And so these things we were trying to do, while again, I don't blame anybody in spring 2020 for feeling like we need to do something, we need to help people have some cash. That doesn't fix an economy which has been shut down for supply reasons. In fact, it leads to other problems. And that's sort of how things have evolved since then. The other problems, the other worries.
Just a question, are you going to talk about distribution and logistics and supply?
Yep, we'll get there. That's part of what's going on, right? And part of the, and so I just want to say, big picture, you end up with a situation because of all this money out there that's chasing, people want to buy more goods, the goods aren't there, supply chain problems are all over the place. Some of that has to do with things happening in the rest of the world, like in China responding to the pandemic. Some of it has to do with stuff in U.S. ports. Some of it has to do with just within the U.S. that people who drive trucks and do warehouses and supply stuff to stores can't do it in the same way. This is, remember, a remarkably disruptive time for business and a scary time for business. And a lot of people who had jobs that they were perfectly happy with at some level, they didn't necessarily weren't so happy about that job during a pandemic. I mean, it's one thing to be a trucker delivering stuff, picking up stuff and delivering it not in a pandemic, but if you're really worried about your health, that stops being an interesting job pretty quickly. And so you get a situation where you've got, this is the inflation rate going back to 1970 again. So you can see the high inflation rates that happened in the 70s, early 80s. You can see a little bit of inflation in around 2007. And you can see what happens to inflation here. We've sort of been tootling along with some up and down in the Great Recession at about 2% inflation, and then all of a sudden there it goes, right? And the there it goes is because we just dumped, $2 trillion worth of extra spending into the economy, more than $2 trillion, at a time when the economy could not expand to do that. It couldn't expand on the services side because it was shut down by the pandemic, and it couldn't expand on the goods side because the supply chains were all having such troubles, and also the processes of getting together and making things were severely disrupted. So you had too much money chasing too few goods, as the economists would say, and too much money chasing too few goods means that by what have I got here? By summer 2001 or 2021, we're at about 5 or 6%. We get up to more recently more like 8 or 9%. There's been a little dip here, but one of the big questions obviously is where are we going next with this, right? And so I need to come back to that in a second, but where are we going with this? And then to make it all just a little worse, because, troubles never come singly and all of that, in 2022, in February, Russia invades Ukraine, right? And what that does, these are two major exporters for the world of energy stuff and of foodstuffs like wheat. And so all of a sudden, on top of these other worries of supply chains and goods and services and too much demand out there in the economy, you've got a situation where for other reasons, energy prices go way up and food prices go way up. Now, as I said, the inflation was already on its way, in summer 2021, but, this last little boom is kind of the Russia invading Ukraine effect in some ways. And so, sometimes you can overcome one bit of bad luck, or maybe things could have faded out after summer 2021, but boy, after the Russia-Ukraine thing, they weren't fading. I mean, it was going to be still a severe problem. So that takes us more or less up to this last summer, and a difficult time. And so I guess in describing the economy now, I want to just sort of make 3 points, and then I'll wrap it up, and we can, just take questions or talk about things if you like. first question is, where's inflation headed, right? We got up to 8%. Are we going back to these days? Are we coming back down? What's going on? And one of the things in the news a lot of the time is that the Federal Reserve sort of has the job fighting inflation, and what they traditionally do is when inflation goes up, they raise interest rates. And the idea of raising interest rates is it slows down the economy. People aren't as likely to buy houses and cars and things like that, and when they're less likely to buy houses and cars and things involving borrowing, then you won't have as much money chasing goods, and you will slow down the economy. The difficult part is, I just said slow down the economy like 8 times in a row, right? And so you're fighting inflation, but you're doing it at a cost of slowing some other things down. And so, I mean, it used to be, this isn't 100% true, but economists used to say that economic expansions don't die of old age, the Fed kills them. At some point, the Fed gets worried that inflation is going up, they raise interest rates, and they bring on the next recession. And that's, you know, a little unfair, but maybe not totally unfair. So what's the Fed doing through this? The blue line here is exactly the same as the previous blue line. It's the inflation rate. The red line is what's called the federal funds interest rate, and the terminology doesn't really matter. There's one interest rate that the Federal Reserve focuses on. And whenever they have a meeting, they say, this is the interest rate we're going to move up or down, and they say by how much. It's the interest rate they control. And it's actually, the federal funds rate is the overnight rate at which banks and some other big institutions loan to each other. So it's very short term, very safe, one financial institution to another overnight, and the Fed can control that rate. It can basically say what that rate is. And so when it makes that federal funds rate go up or down, then all the other interest rates in the economy kind of adjust along with it to some extent. So what's the Fed done in the past? Well, so the blue line is inflation, and you can see that this policy rate that the Fed uses, the federal funds rate, when inflation goes up, the red line goes up too. In fact, the red line often goes up higher than the inflation rate. Every time inflation goes up, the red line goes up to stop inflation. And here too, you can see, here's inflation, and here they are raising the rate again. So that's standard, basic intro econ stuff. You've got inflation, the Federal Reserve goes and raises the federal funds rate. But here's the problem. You notice that in all these previous examples, when inflation went up, the red line, the policy interest rate, went up above the rate of inflation. It was higher than the rate of inflation, over and over and over and over again. And here, the red line is not nearly up to the rate of inflation yet. So we know that you can bring down inflation by putting the policy interest rate above the rate of inflation. We've demonstrated that over and over the last 50 years. We do not know whether you can bring down the rate of inflation by having a policy interest rate that's still 4 or 5% below. And so that's the experiment which is going on right now. And there's different ways to think about that experiment, and in the spirit of the dueling grandmothers, I will tell you both of them. So one argument is that the Fed has been too slow, too late, too little. They should have moved sooner, which I think is probably right. They should have moved faster, which is not quite as obviously right. That's a pretty sharp increase. But the worry is that because the Fed has been a little bit too slow, you notice inflation is taking off here a little bit, and the Fed is flat, 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 flat until it's like up there. Maybe the Fed should have moved 6 months sooner. So the argument then becomes the Fed didn't move fast enough, it hasn't moved fast enough, we're likely to see 3 or 4 more rounds of increases in interest rates, and with those we will almost virtually with certainty get a recession in 2023 somewhere along the way, a real recession, a nasty, unpleasant rate of unemployment goes up recession. And so that's one side of things. The other side is that at least some of these causes of inflation are temporary. A lot of these spending programs that were pumping up the level of demand are rolling off the books. They're expiring as time goes on. We haven't pumped up the unemployment insurance. We aren't still sending out stimulus checks. The Paycheck Protection Plan was a one-time thing. So those are slowly fading away. Moreover, while the Ukraine-Russia thing has been extraordinarily disruptive, in a way, maybe we've seen the worst of it. Maybe the war itself will go on, but the effects on energy and other prices, as an economist, the war is less interesting to me than the price effects. That's a scary thought, isn't it? But the effects on inflation, we may have had most of those already. And so, in that sense, perhaps a good chunk of this inflation is sort of temporary. It was based on these things that have faded out. And so what the Fed is really trying to do here is, it's trying to say, some of this inflation is temporary, and some of it might be permanent. And we're going to raise interest rates to fight the permanent part, while hoping that the temporary part fades away over time. So which of those stories is true? I'm not a fortune teller. I can tell you that in the next few months we will learn, right? Either this inflation will start to fade away, even though the interest rate didn't go up that high, that'll tell you a lot of it was temporary, or it won't fade. In which case we'll be saying the Fed should have moved harder, faster, sooner, because maybe they really let inflation out of the cage, and maybe we're back in that time of the late 1970s again. There are various ways of trying to look ahead and see what is inflation likely to be. We'll talk about those more if you want. Like there's certain things you can invest in that last over 30 years, and you can look at those and see what is the market expecting about inflation and stuff like that. I would say all those are fuzzy right now. We don't really have a clean answer. So it's a genuine question about where the economy is now. Has the Fed done enough? Is it doing it fast enough? And I don't know the answer fully. Second thing about the economy right now is about labor markets. One of the really weird things about the current labor market is that we've just had this severe pandemic recession, and look at the unemployment rate compared to historically the last 50 years. We're at like 3.5%. What the heck is going on? How can you have such a low unemployment rate at a time of such economic disruption? What's happening out there in the workforce? And I guess to answer that question, what I want to try and convey is that when you lose a job, you are not automatically unemployed. And the reason is that the definition of unemployment that's used in the survey they do for unemployment is that you have to be without a job, but also looking for a job, actively looking. So there are questions about how actively are you looking. And if you lose your job and it's the middle of a pandemic and you just think, I'm not looking, it's the middle of a pandemic, I'm going down to my rec room and staying there for a year or two, you don't get counted as unemployed. In effect, you get counted like a retired person. You're counted as, in the jargon, out of the labor force. So when you lose a job, you have to look for a new job to be counted as unemployed. Otherwise, you're just counted as out of the labor force. So the question then becomes, well, what's going on here in terms of jobs and employment? And I guess I probably got these a little out of order, but I'll show you this one. So this is the ratio, not of, but of employment to population. So it's the entire adult population. The reason it only goes up to like 65% is that all retired people are included in this total, as well as, say, parents who are staying home with kids and things like that. So you don't expect this to be 100%. What you sort of see since about 1970 is, from about 1970 on, you see these ups and downs with recessions and so on. But this period, broadly speaking, from the mid-70s up to 2000, is women entering the workforce, or as I like to say, entering the paid workforce, since Lord knows they've been working before. But entering the paid workforce, and so being counted in the employment to population ratio. And this is an enormous social change of women entering the paid workforce. But that sort of tops out around the year 2000, and you can sort of see it begins to sag downward. There's a big drop in the Great Recession, little bounce back, and then there's that number. And what that tells you is that during the pandemic itself, an awful lot of people, like from 62% to 52%, an awful lot of people left the workforce and they were just gone. They weren't involved in the workforce. They weren't looking for a job, at least for that period of a few months. And then it sort of bounced back. But even now, you can see that the employment to population ratio is still about 2 percentage points below. There's, roughly speaking, 150 million workers in the US economy. So this 2% is something like 3 million people who just are out of the workforce. And many of them are not being counted as unemployed because they're not looking for work. It's possible for a lot of them that if they got the right job opportunity, they would take a job. They'd come back into the workforce again, but they don't get counted in the unemployment statistics. This is sometimes referred to as the Great Resignation. You'll see that term sometimes, but that's like people who sort of said, the hell with it, until this gets straightened out, I'm just not playing that game. And there's, people in that category and in that situation. So one thing that's happening is this lower employment to population ratio. And one of the ways that shows up in the economic statistics, which is a weird one, I think, but interesting, is they count the total number of job openings that businesses post. This is all done by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Everything up here is official government data. It may be wrong, but I didn't make it up. And so the blue line is, again, the unemployment level since 2000. And you can see the number of people employed, I'm sorry. So it's not unemployment in a rate, it's the numbers. There were about 4 million people unemployed through that period, drops to about 2 million unemployed, rises to about 7 million unemployed, and then during the pandemic, all of a sudden we're up to something I'm sorry, I read that backwards. The red line is the unemployment, the blue line is the openings. So you can see that during the recession, the number of people unemployed goes up to 16 million. During the pandemic, it goes up to 22 million. So those are just the number of people unemployed, not the unemployment rate. And then the blue line is the number of job openings businesses are listing. And here's the weird thing, most of the time, the number of unemployed people is bigger than the number of job openings. But since the pandemic, the number of job openings is bigger than the number of unemployed people. Now that's super weird, right? I mean, you sort of think to yourself, how can that even be true, that there are more job openings than there are unemployed people? And the answer, go back a moment, is a lot of people are without a job, but they're not being counted as unemployed because they've left the labor force. So they might come back to one of these openings, but in this unemployment statistics, they don't show up. And so part of what this is telling you is businesses would really like to hire people, but the unemployed people who are looking for work, there are not a whole lot of them out there right now. And there's a number of other people sitting on the sidelines waiting and thinking about whether to come back into the economy or not. So you think to yourself, well, is that going to last? Is that going to go on? And again, these are questions about where the economy is right now. In the spirit of the dueling grandmothers, I could tell you, well, I think they will come back. I think they won't come back. I don't know the answer. It's a really interesting moment. In a big picture sense, the US economy has been headed for decades now. You all know the phrase baby boomer generation, right? The folks who were born those years after World War II up to about the early 1960s. So that generation all hit retirement around about 2010, 2015. We've got more and more people retiring. We have lower and lower birth rates for the country as a whole. In all of US history, and for most countries throughout world history, the number of people has gradually increased over time. The number of workers has gradually increased over time. But given the large number of retirees and the relatively low number of births, the US workforce is not projected to be increasing anymore. It's from about 2030 on. And so we're in a very weird situation where we have not run the US economy on a flat number of workers before. And I think a lot of workers are sort of in an interesting situation. And the way I sort of describe it is the pandemic when you take a job, it's not just the job and the pay, right? It's the job and the pay and the commute, and do you like the people, and do you feel good about the work, and how do you feel about interacting directly with customers, how do you feel directly about the people you interact with daily? It's this whole bundle of things, right? And what the pandemic kind of did to the labor force was, it threw that up in the air like, what do they call it, 52-card pickup, right? It just disrupted everything, right? And all of a sudden, some people found, wow, I really like working from home. And other people found, wow, I really hate working from home. And some people found, oh, I just hate that commute. I can't go back to it. And other people found, I moved to another state and I've been doing this job virtually. And so things got disrupted in a severe way. And people who are working have gotten, they want what they want. And they're willing to try and stick up for it, at least right now. And so a lot of these job openings, they're out there. But a lot of the unemployed people, the people out of the labor force are saying, yeah, maybe not. What else you got? You got a better offer for me? You got to work from home 3 days a week, 5 days a week? What do you got? And so I think this disruption, even though the recession itself was short, the disruption to people's lives and expectations just keeps echoing on and on and on and on. And that's part of what we're seeing here in these great resignation, people opting out, a lot of job openings, but you read articles in the paper that employers sort of say interesting things like, I saw a comment the other day that I think it was in the Star Tribune that made me grin, but some employers said, we're going out and we're offering people all these bonuses to sign up for our company. And then we thought to ourselves, maybe we should offer those to our current employees. If it's worth paying that to hire people, maybe it's worth paying that so you don't lose people, right? And so we're entering this economy of labor is not as immediately available. It's harder to hire people. People have more options. And how that shapes out in the years ahead is going to be one of the big stories of the U.S. economy. So my third big thing to bring up then, after the inflation thing, the workforce thing, is about productivity growth. And boy, you say productivity growth, you can almost feel people roll their eyes again. You've been very patient with me, so it's my last thing. Productivity growth is usually measured as output per hour. Not a complicated idea. How much real output is produced for every hour worked in the economy. And productivity is the central, most important thing about standard of living. Because if output per hour goes up over time, then in a gradual sort of way, so do people's incomes, so do government taxes, so do people's opportunities. If output per hour doesn't go up, then you're living in a zero-sum world. The only way some people can benefit is if other people lose. And so I didn't put up the numbers here because the productivity numbers are hard to interpret for reasons that don't matter. But they, from about 1995 to 2005, during the dot-com boom and the arrival of the internet in all of our lives in a really big way, the productivity growth in the U.S. economy is about 3% per year. If you look since about 2005, through the Great Recession, through the decade, up to now, it's been about 1% per year. And so the obvious question would be, Tim, you seem like the kind of person who would really get excited about 3% versus 1%, but why should I be excited, Tim? And the answer there would be that it's per year. Per year. So if 10 years go by and productivity growth is 1% instead of 3%, you don't lose 2% total, you lose 20% total. And so on average, people's incomes are 20% lower for everyone in the US economy than if we had been able to keep productivity going at 3% per year. Government budgets and taxes are on average 20% lower. And I sometimes say, I don't care which of my grandmothers you represent in the room, but everybody's life is easier with some productivity growth because there's more resources. And when society has problems, and Lord knows society has problems, it's easier to deal with those problems if you've got a growing, robust economy than if you've got an economy that's just treading water. You've got the resources to deal with your problems. An obvious answer that people give me would be something along the lines of, well, Tim, I don't want to pollute the planet, I don't want to destroy workers, I don't want to, and yeah, I agree with all that, right? And I'm not quarreling with any of that. I'm just saying that there is growth out there which is environmentally clean, which does give people better raises, which does do things. And that's the kind of growth we'd like to encourage. Of course, we don't want to encourage growth that ruins the planet or something like that. It would be foolish. So how can we get to that kind of growth? There's no short-term way. There's no way the government or the Congress can sort of say, here, let's spend $100 billion and boom, we've got growth. I mean, it doesn't work that way. The formula is more subtle, but the formula is well known. What makes productivity growth work is smart and well-educated workers with good levels of experience, what economists call human capital. Businesses investing in equipment, computer technology, all those kinds of things, what we call physical capital. Investments in new technology and new ways of doing things, more health, more education, a cleaner environment, all those sorts of things. And it's sort of a mixture of that human capital and physical capital and technology, all happening in a world where businesses can look long-term enough that they can plan now to make some changes and know that it will pay off over time. And during the pandemic, nobody's been able to do that. You haven't been able to have a situation where you could think, let's think long-term. Again, Tuesday has been long-term for the last couple of years now. And so getting back to that world where you can have that kind of developing growth is perhaps the ultimate social question. Because, at least to me, it involves whether or not we live in a world where if one group is going to gain, someone else has to lose. That's a zero-sum world, and when there's no productivity growth, we live in a zero-sum world. Or whether we live in a world where there's some consistent productivity growth over time, and we can help people without feeling like somebody else needs to be immediately bear the costs of that or the full cost of that. We can share the growth rather than just sharing a fixed pie. So that's not something that's going to be solved in the next year or two or three. But one of the things I tend to focus on as we think about things like the kids who were out of school during the pandemic, or we think about getting people to college, or we think about supporting scientists and researchers, or we think about supporting the med tech companies, in Minnesota or other companies, we need to think about, what kind of base are we laying down for productivity growth that can carry us into a positive sum future rather than a zero-sum game. That's all I had to talk about. Less than time, I'm happy to take questions about this, or if you just want to know about economics, I'm your guy. So thanks for coming.
So just jumping off of that last point you were talking, I'm just thinking with the pandemic, with the logistics, and the inability to get goods that people want from China or wherever, how much of a blow did that deal to globalization and towards regional manufacturing base and arguments you might have?
No, that's good. You're jumping deep in the pool here, and I'm here for that. So big picture, since the signature of various treaties after World War II, we've lived in a globalizing economy. And by globalizing, I mean that the global economy has a bigger and bigger effect on all of us day to day. I mean, I think about when I went off to college in the late 70s, and if you'd said to me, what effect does China have on your day-to-day life? The effect would have been zero, right? I mean, anyone who, China was an immensely poor country. They had some ping pong players. That was about it. I mean, there was no question that, financially or manufacturing, there were cheap goods from Korea, there were cheap goods from Japan. Late 70s, there's nothing from China. And so China could, almost have fallen off the face of the earth, and it wouldn't have economically made a difference to the United States. Now, China's economy melting up and melting down has the power to throw the entire global economy into a recession. And that's a really different world. That's globalization. So the question that's being raised is, are we all taking a step away from globalization now? And it's not just the things I've talked about, but it's the various trade treaties, it's the worries about China politically and in terms of human rights. It's all kinds of stuff like that, all mixed into a big container, together with the shipping problems, logistics problems, and can you really rely on these far, far away global supply chains? And the short answer is that I think if you look at the things people are saying near the top of well-known governments, there does seem to be a step back. And so I saw a comment from Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, a little while back, and she said, what we need to do when we think about our global supply chains is we need to think about networks of friends and allies. And so that was a little, I'm sure, dig at, not Russia, not China. We're thinking about globalization, but not really. We're thinking about global, like our hemisphere and Europe, but we're not thinking about everywhere anymore. Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, made a similar comment recently that, we're in favor of globalization among those we can trust and among those who are worthy suppliers. And so I think we are taking a step back from that in a broad sense. This other side of it, though, which I think is interesting, is if you look at, you'll know more about me than you really want to know. But if you go to the World Trade Organization website, they've just put out their World Trade statistics for 2022, people, and you can see them online. And if you do that, and I had a good day yesterday doing that, was that there are different kinds of trade in the world economy. And one of the patterns, for example, is trade that is purely digital. Trade that happens completely over the internet.
Nothing manufactured.
And nothing is manufactured, nothing is sent, nothing crosses a border. And if you look at that kind of trade, you see that it has doubled in the global economy in the last 6 or 7 years. It's up to something like 3.7 trillion now, which is not yet huge in global terms. Global GDP is more or less 100 trillion, but it's doubling. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think what is happening in part is that we think of global trade as shipping cars and computer chips and wheat and oil and physical things. And what's happening more and more is that what we're shipping is like when you have an X-ray taken, the X-ray gets shipped to a radiologist in India who does the first cut of looking at it, and then the next day, your doctor sort of has somebody else's opinion on it already. I mean, a doctor looks at it. I don't mean just some random person. Or if you look at insurance companies or pension funds, or you look at all those kinds of things, a lot of those are now run by people in other countries. If you're in a company that has a big accounting firm, the accounting firm may be US based, but a lot of the work, I'll bet you, is being done by people in other countries. And the US accounting firm is saying, here are our results, but it was somebody in some faraway place that actually did the work, but they did it all virtually, right? And so I think we are shifting. I think there is something pushing back against globalization, but on the other side, the technology is pushing a different kind of trade forward. That's a fair answer.
Does this pandemic charting compared to the Depression charting before my time?
Sure. Yeah, I thought about how far back should I go. I figured 50 years was enough. But so the Depression, during the Great Depression, the size of the U.S. economy falls by roughly a third. And so the fall is comparable to the earlier line here. But what makes the Great Depression great, if it's not bad to use that term, is it lasts almost 4 years. And so it's from the stock market crash of 29 up through 33. And so it's not just that and the unemployment is measured differently then, but is probably roughly 25%, a good chunk of that time. And so what made the Great Depression great was its length and its depth. But precisely why I keep saying I don't blame anybody for what they did in spring 2020 was those movements were like Great Depression-like movements. They were comparable in size, and at the moment you don't know where they were going, right? So.
What are you going to talk to us about next week?
Well, Mark has me lined up to talk about something, what they used to say on the old Monty Python shows, and now for something completely different. I will talk about the relationship between economics and morality. So I promise you there will be no graphs. There will, however, be this discussion of the question of, do we live our economic life to some extent outside of what's good and bad? And when we're good and bad, we're going to church, we're donating, we're helping, we're volunteering, but that's somehow separate from a lot of our economic life. And there's an argument there that goes back to the Greeks, and I will try and lay it out for you how it emerged over the last couple of millennia. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies may be what I need to come back and talk about another time. But in a big picture sense, Bitcoin isn't that large. It goes up and down, it gets a lot of headlines, people make and lose money. But Bitcoin doesn't involve anything being produced. And so Bitcoin is a way of buying and selling things. And so it doesn't show up in the falls or the rises. It's more like what would happen if the stock market went up and down. And again, if the stock market goes up and down, nothing is being produced or not produced. It's just the value, or houses go up and down. They aren't being built or not built, just the price of this thing going up and down. So it has effects in that way, but in the stuff I'm talking about, it really doesn't show up at all. But if you want I've got to talk, as I said to Mark at some point, about, you want to know how blockchains work and so on. I can take a shot at explaining it to you. So,
Let's show our appreciation to Jim.
thanks so much.
Yeah, that's the clearest you can